a video game composer for over 22 years, and I started Video Games Live, a touring video game show about, that was in 2002, we started that, and I've been on some shitty TV shows on G4, and actually our shows weren't too shitty, G4 is shitty. I'm gonna call it. But anyway, we're here at the Classic Gaming Expo, so I thought it'd be cool to talk about classic video game music and how we used to do things way back when. It's definitely different than the way we do things now, for sure. So let me see. When I got involved in the industry, does it work now? Check this out. I'm not this tall. Oh, there it is. So I'm going to just go by hand there. Very small. Yeah, when I got involved, late 80s, early 90s, I had started working on the NES, Game Boy, and we were doing some PC stuff for like floppy, Apple II we were still working on, or Macintosh. And I didn't come from a programmer background, because most of the cats who were doing game audio back then were basically computer programmers. So they were literally, and with music, there's like a note number. It's all mathematics, right? So it's a note number on the keyboard. It's how hard you press down on the key. That's the velocity or the volume. And there's how long you pressed on the key. So the note, the note length, and when you took your finger off the keyboard. And that was pretty much, that's mathematically music, right? And so back then, people were programming music, by hand, typing stuff into the keyboard, like, okay, note 77, we'll make the value is like between, 0 and 128 or 127. We'll make that 64, that value, that's length, and this and that. So that's why a lot of the video game music, back then sounded kind of very mechanical and this and that, because people were, typing music. I mean, how do you type the blues? That's, you can't do that. And there's always a big debate. People always ask me, do you like music from back in the 80s and 90s? It's like way better than the music nowadays, isn't it? And to me, I'm going to be very honest. To me, I would say they're both really good. I don't think one is better than the other. I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's crap. See, what people don't remember? People remember the Marios, Tetris, Zelda, Castlevania, Metroid, Mega Man. We all love and remember those. Those are all the great, some of the best, greatest video game melodies ever written for our time. But there was a lot of shit out there too, and we all tend to forget the shit. So 95% of the stuff that was out there was really bad. And the same can be said nowadays as well. There's a lot of crap out there, but we still, in this generation as well, have the Halos and the Metal Gear Solids and the Final Fantasies, and the music these days isn't too bad either. So I don't think one is better or worse than the other. I think they're equal, but they're different. But one of the things that was the most important thing when doing music back then, because it didn't matter if we had live orchestras or choirs or electric guitars and drummers or whatever, licensed music, anything, it didn't matter. Back then, it was all about melody. And that's one of the things I always tell composers who are doing music nowadays, or upcoming composers, is it's still all about melody. That's the most important thing. So when you take a game like Mario, or Zelda, or Tetris, it all had great melody. Didn't matter if they had a live orchestra, or a guitar, or just a little tiny, one-channel PSG voice, And so melody is always the most important thing when creating video game music. It's a thing that people are going to remember. I mean, back then, we only had maybe, take a game like Sonic the Hedgehog. Each song, all 10 levels, were 45 seconds in length. That was it, and then they looped, right? That's all you had. Now, all the music in Sonic was great, every one of it, because it had that great melody. But anyway, backing up, even before Sonic, when we would do, so when I first kind of came in the industry, I wasn't a programmer. I mean, I had programmed, you know, I think any kid growing up in the 80s, you know, I was programming like, you know, in BASIC, you know, like, you know, dirty text adventures and things like that, but, you know, so I kind of understood what programming was about. I understood kind of the philosophy behind it, but I couldn't, like, you know, blow code in assembly or C++ or anything like that, right? But I understand, okay, 10, go to this, input A string, I got it, okay, it's all good. So, but I never programmed in my video game career as a professional. What I did is I would sit down with the programmers and say, okay, what are you know, what do you need from the music? And again, it was, what's the note number? How long is the note? And even in the early things, we didn't even have note velocity. We didn't even have note volume. So it was just the note and the length of it, and that's it. And around this same time, MIDI had kind of been invented and implemented. And MIDI is a musical instrument digital interface. That's what MIDI stands for. And what it was is basically on a synthesizer or a keyboard, there was a MIDI cable, and it was basically zeros and ones, just digital information of exactly what I just spoke about. You know, what note, how long are you holding it for, how hard did you hit it, and it was all values between, you know, 1 and 128, you know, 0 to 128, 7, 8, whatever, I forget, 30 years old. So anyway, and so I sat down with the programmers and I said, well, couldn't you take, if I could take this information out of the keyboard and plug it directly into the machine. See, all these machines had a sound chip, just like they all had graphic chips and this and that. They had little sound chips. So whether it was the FM synthesis of the Genesis or the 8-voice kind of sample channel of the Super Nintendo, or the 3 PSG voices of the Game Boy and the NES with 1 white noise channel for percussion, they all had sound chips. So what I did is I had programmers build me systems that enabled my keyboard, my MIDI keyboard, to jack right into the sound chip on the platform. And that gave me a completely unfair advantage over everybody else who was doing this in the industry at the time. But even before that, the first game I worked on was the original Prince of Persia. And it was funny because when we had done Prince of Persia, a lot of people, you know, the producers and designers came to me and they said, well, you know, we want to do, you know, we have 13 levels in the game or whatever the hell it was, and so just make like 1-minute songs looping in 13 different ones. And I'm like, but why? And they said, well, that's what video games do. That's what you do. When you go into the level, you start the music, and when you end, you beat the level song, you know? And I thought, I just didn't see, when I was playing Prince of Persia, and I saw those beautiful animations, and I'm like, and you know, and they wanted music that was, you know, kind of like merry-go-round children's music, and I said, but it's like a Middle Eastern thing, and we can use different, you know, chord progressions and you know, melodic things. Just because I don't necessarily have a, you know, a snake charming flute doesn't mean that I can still have that same kind of vibe with, you know, the different chord patterns and the different keys that I can go in musically. I can still make it sound Arabian and Middle Eastern. And why does there have to be music all the time? I think it takes away from it. Let's make, again, because it had like a little cutscene cinematics, and it was kind of this cool storyline going on and these beautiful animations. I said, why don't we have like no music, and then when things happen in the game, whether he pulls out his sword, he drinks a potion, when he dies, when he opens a door, during these cinematics, when he meets the, you know, an enemy or the princess or whatever the hell the bad guy's name was. Why don't we trigger music at those points? You know, it's a very different way of of approaching a video game, kind of platform video game like that. And people argued with me. I mean, we had screaming matches, saying, that's not the way video games are made. And I'm like, well, great, good. Why do they have to be, who says they have to be made like this? So anyway, so that was kind of an approach. And then I won a bunch of awards for Prince of Persia, so they had to shut up. So that was good news. They had to listen to me. And they made me the full-time music guy, because I was actually a game tester. I was hired as a games tester, and then I would bug the vice president of the company every day, please let me do music, I'll do it for free, and if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. So I got lucky on that. But back then, this is before I had the MIDI system too. What I would do it was literally, when you say, people talk about zeros and ones, it's digital. It literally was zeros and ones. I mean, I would, in order to create a sound for the NES or the Game Boy, I had a chart of like 64 squares, and you either had to put a 0 or a 1 in there. And that was all you had, a 0 or a 1. And the different boxes, and I used to do it on paper, and the different boxes, this is how, to create what the sound sounded like. So it was like a sine wave or a sawtooth wave, just different like ooh, like things like that. And if you made this 1 instead of a 0, it would kind of go ooh. And then if you, oh shit, what if I do 2 1s in a row? And it was kind of like ooh. I'm like, wow, making music, this is fantastic. So you would literally sit there for days and days, just randomly tweaking zeros and ones, and it's like, yeah, that kind of sounds like a flute now or something, And I would literally have sheets and sheets of paper, and then you would give that paper to the programmer, and he'd sit there and go 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, and and then you'd have to double check his work, and then he'd compile the game. And that took like 45 minutes. And then you'd come back and like, yeah, that sounds like crap. Let me do that again. Let me change this one to a 0 and a 1. And then you give them that. Oh my God. So it went on and on. And then from the music standpoint, so they used like ASCII files. And what I had them do is I would say, well, why don't you take my MIDI file? Because they were just coming out with these sequencers, music sequencers for PC. So I was using Cakewalk 1.0 for DOS, which was basically what it would do is it would record MIDI information into a PC. I had like an IBM PS2 kind of weird thing. It was like a Mac kind of. The screen was in the monitor and everything, but like a laptop. Anyway, we would basically, we would take them, so I would write these MIDI files and the sequencer, save them as a MIDI file, and then we port them to an ASCII file, which is again basically zeros and one, and you would just get a paragraph of numbers. It would spit out a paragraph of numbers. And the problem would be is that when you would, a typical keyboard is 88 notes across, and so, but when you would go out of range, just because a piano has 88 notes doesn't mean the system knew what the hell 88 notes were. So there's definitely like a range that you could only go in. And so when I would play and I would play too high, it would just totally crash the system, just like, what the hell is this? Ah, and it would freak out. And you get this high-pitched sound or just digital crap. It was excellent. Nine Inch Nails uses a lot of that stuff in their music, actually. But so it would freak out and the system would crash, and you'd have to figure out what the hell happened. Oh, I used a note out of range, damn. Let me bring that whole phrase down an octave or two. Or if you would hold a note for too long, it didn't like that. So, so to get any kind of long notes, you really couldn't have long notes. Like, so you would have to kind of go, if you wanted one note that was just going like, da, it's kind of like maybe as a counter melody or something, you couldn't do da, you'd have to do like da, 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 da. And again, this is why some of the music was like, all kind of sounded, kind of very syncopated and very, kind of the beat all the time, because you couldn't have long notes, basically. And then you had other things too, like attack and decay, sustain. What that means is, again, these are the zeros and ones you would mess with. So if you had like, instead of when you would hit a note, it'd be like really hard. So it'd be like, beep, you know, but if you mess with some of the zeros and ones, it could actually fade in. So it's kind of like almost like a violin or a string. Oh, that's cool. And same thing with decay. When you took your finger off, it would go, instead of just stopping, it would go like, you know, and it would kind of like fade away. A nice little reverb tone almost to it. But the thing you always had to be careful of is you only had 4 voices back then. And I'm talking NES Game Boy right now, right? 4 voices, that's all you got. So that means, so they can never overlap over each other. You can never have more than 4. So, for example, in music, if you do a chord, right, that's like 3, you know, like a chord, like a C chord, you have 3 notes that make up that one chord. Well, that's your whole music system gone right there. 1 chord, you're done. And then, like I said, you had this white noise channel, which it was either or tss, and that was it. So that kind of sounds like drums, and a hi-hat kind of yeah, it's a snare and a kick, sure. And so you would kind of mess with that for percussion, and then you had 3 notes, so they could never overlap. So you were always kind of cautious about, you know, how you use those 3 notes when they happened and how you had to happen. Oh yeah, and we had sound effects as well. Damn it. So now you can go back and listen to Mario and realize what a genius Koji Kondo was, because that's all he had, you know? And you had those amazing sound effects as well with the music. And when you did stuff like that, it was all about prioritizing as well. So I'd sit down with the programmer and say, because you didn't want to just play your music, because you wanted to use all the channels you had for music. You didn't want to leave one channel open just for sound effects. You'd be dead, because now you only have 2 notes, right? No, it's like, okay, at least I have 3 notes. But you always wanted to prioritize stuff. So when a sound effect would come in, that had to be the highest priority, right? And so you had to drop out one of the things. So you had to figure out, well, which one of these 3 do I want to drop out? So you had to be very careful when you put each of these 3 things on their own channel. You know, you had to prioritize. Okay, I want the middle one of that chord to drop out, because that's not as important, and the sound effects will cover it anyway. So it was, so again, back then, it wasn't about, it didn't take you a long time creating the song. Sometimes, because you only had a couple of notes to work with, sometimes you do a song in, you know, a couple minutes, or, you know, maybe a day. But it took you 3 weeks, 4 weeks, sometimes a month, to get it to sound good, you know, to get it to sound like something. That was the challenge back then. Now, doing game music, the challenge is now it's so, you have so much production value and this and that. It's like now you're like recording live orchestras and going to a studio and mixing and mastering and blah, 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 and making it all interactive. So now it's like even more crazy. And of course now you don't have 10 45-second songs. You have like, I was just talking to Russell Brower, who's the audio director and composer from Blizzard, and he's just wrapping up Mr. Pandaria. He had like 6 hours of unique live recorded music for that game. I mean, it's insane. But, so, you know, again, both eras had its challenges. But the thing, like I said, the thing back then was the voices and working intelligently. Then when the Sega Genesis came along, now we had 6 voices to work with. And they were FM synthesis, like the Yamaha DX7, which was a popular keyboard in the 80s. And FM synthesis was more like that kind of punchy synth sound, right? And the cool thing about it, like I said, it was more like a synthesizer. So it wasn't bleeps and bloops. It was kind of like this analog synth thing. And that's when we got, you know, we were able to get the MIDI plug right into that FM chip. And so I could play the Genesis on my keyboard and hear what it would sound like. And then record that record the notes and sequences and things that I was playing as a sequencer, and then use that file and download it into the Genesis. And then Genesis had, though, was that out of those 6 channels, you could actually use one of them. And then audio was always like an afterthought back then, you know, and that was one of the things that I really wanted to kind of change. That was, you know, in films, audio is post-production, right? So they make the film, they have to cut the scene together, then give it to the audio guys to put sound effects and music on. So that was kind of their mentality. But with video games, they're so much different because, again, we have to carve out space, we have to carve out the technology. Are we streaming in the music at the beginning of the level? Is it happening during the level while something else is loading and this and that? So, you know, I really wanted to change the way people felt and thought about video game music. And I knew if I could get more space on that cartridge, I could use more samples, my music could be longer, it could start to sound like legitimate stuff, and that wasn't happening a lot back then. So I was lucky enough to work with some great teams in the early 90s. David Perry, who went on to form Shiny Entertainment and then formed Gaikai, which they just sold to Sony a couple weeks ago. It's pretty much invented the whole cloud gaming thing. Him and On Live kind of doing it separately, but David was, you know, programmer back then. We first, as a team, there was a group of about 10 of us. We worked on Global Gladiators together on the Genesis. Then we moved to Cool Spot on the Super Nintendo and Genesis. Same team then did Aladdin on the Genesis, which was the #1 selling game, I think, in '93 or '94. And then we went on to do Earthworm Jim together. And again, we always fought for bigger cartridge sizes. So we would go to the president of Virgin or Sega or whoever we were working for at the time and say, look, we want as much space as possible. We know it costs more to manufacture the game, but the payoff is going to be so much more because, you know, people are going to enjoy the experience more, you know. And so we were always able to, and we would always do demos. I'd do demos with music, say, hey, check out what it sounds like if I had this space. And so I would use samples, back then people would only use samples for like, you know, once or twice a game because they didn't have the space. So it'd be like, go, you know, start, you know, fight, you know, that way. And that was about it. But because I had so much more space, I was able to, I would thrash the shit out of that sample channel. I wanted samples going on every second of the time, and I would just prioritize them. So I would do a kick and a snare as a sample instead of that crappy sound. I would actually record a kick and a snare. And then when a sound effect came in of a voice or a collection of a token or whatever, you know, it would knock out that sample channel, but everything else was covering it, so it was okay. So priority, I just constantly wanted to thrash that sample channel at all times. And then when the Super Nintendo came around, now you had 8 channels, but they were all sample channels, every single one of them. So that was kind of cool. So like when ActRaiser came out, if you guys remember when like ActRaiser first hit, and you kind of heard those strings in the beginning, and it was kind of like this pseudo-orchestral sound. You're like, oh my gosh, it was like so amazing, right? And so that had its advantages and disadvantages as well. The Genesis had a much beefier kind of analog sound to it because it had that FM chip. The Super Nintendo had a more realistic sound, but it was really kind of missing that low end and that kind of, you know, bassy kind of analog thing because it was just 8 digital samples. And it was so funny because back in those days, so if you wanted to, everything was like controlled by Nintendo back then. So it still is on their systems, but back then it was really bad. And so if you wanted a sound for the Super Nintendo, what you had to do is you had to record a sound on a DAT tape. Which was a digital audio tape, these little suckers, and they had machines and stuff back then. And you had to send that to Nintendo. The guy would then take that sound and he would loop it and then send it back to you maybe a couple months later. And then whatever he gave you, that's what you were stuck with. And and so you couldn't create your own sounds for the Super Nintendo. You had to go through Nintendo just to make a sound. And the name of the sound file, when it would come back, would be like whatever, violin1.sol, shit out of luck. That's what they called the file, because you couldn't create it yourself because it was all Nintendo had to, had all their priority stuff. So SOL files. If you ask anyone who programmed on the Super Nintendo, ask them what the audio files were called. They were the SOL files. And so that was just awful, right? So you had to, so it was kind of hard. And of course, Nintendo always had the best samples that they would never share with anyone else. So, when Super Mario World, it was like, oh my God, it was so awesome, and they had banjos and so many great sounds. Like, hey, can we get those sounds? Like, no. So, okay, but here's my banjo sound. It would come back and it would sound like shit. So, yes, I was SOL. So that was always, that had a set of challenges as well too. And the thing to remember is all these systems had completely new and different hardware platforms, had all completely new audio systems. So once a new audio platform came out, you had to start from scratch. You had to, and the programmers had to create, they're called audio drivers. And they were all terrible because, they weren't really audio guys who were programming them. They were just programmers. And there would be, for each system, there would be about 4 or 5 different audio drivers floating around, and they were all ass. And so it was just a matter of, rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty, and trying to figure out, trying to make something sound right. And then, can I get pitch bend in? And sometimes you can get pitch bend, and that was all really crazy and weird, and downloading and compiling and getting into the code. I mean, it was a lot of waiting around, but back then you'd always play the game and, kind of make notes like, oh, okay, boy, this gunshot is too loud. So, okay, so I'd make a note of that. Okay, gunshot too loud. So next time when we would compile, go in and turn that volume from 96, let's turn it down to 90. And then I'd recompile. It's like, damn it, it's too loud still. Okay, make a note of that. Turn it down to 80. And then you put that in, it's like, shit, too soft. Damn it. So it'd take 5 days to get one sound effect kind of the level where you did. And then when you put the music in, it's like, oh, now everything's too loud, So that was always a challenge. The drivers nowadays, it's amazing because you can play the game and have the sound effects right there, and actually the composer, the audio guy, can sit there and tweak it right as you're playing the game. So big difference, big difference. And we don't have to worry about any priorities now. You have massive amounts of channels. You can stream multiple streams. So I could record a live orchestra, and I could record the same song, 10 different arrangements of it. Maybe one's big, it has a choir, and one has big percussion. And I can actually mute each one of those channels and tell the programmer, hey, there's 100 guys on horseback coming to kick your ass with swords. Play this version. But when there's only 10 guys left, then play this version. I can mute the choirs, I can mute the this and that. So has come such a long way in such a short period of time. But anyway, so that's kind of the thing back then. I know we don't have a ton of time. If anyone has any questions, though, sure, right there.